Hi there. Just in case you are unable to play my demo physically for yourselves, I've decided to provide a walkthrough of my final submission and evaluate some of the aspects of the demo itself and briefly describe what's happening and perhaps some of my thoughts during this process. Afterwards, I will record a new video which critically analyses each of these aspects on things of what I appreciated and where I believe I could improve. Thank you. So, to begin with, I've included some ambient music just to give the atmosphere some depth and believability. Instantly, we can see a large moon in the sky and a sky that slowly pans across. My weather system fully interacts with the environment, where things get gradually wetter the more it rains. And in logical areas, puddles will start to form. On the foliage itself, small rain droplets will appear and disappear to try and complete this illusion of realistic weather. The rain's refraction effect can be seen really well at this angle. As you can see off into the distance, I have 3 layers of clouds which I've painted and placed upon 3 cloud rings that would slowly circulate around the whole area of the map. The lights themselves in this lantern is slightly animated, using a cosine and a sine wave to determine the values of the brightness of the light. I managed to create a subtle flicker that would fake the effects of this flame. At certain glancing angles, you can see there's small flecks in the rock work just to try and add some more depth to the believability of the rock. The entire map is of a more stylized design, but I did try to include a more realistic approach to the sculpture and the material design throughout. Here we can see where water would accumulate and run off over the years, causing some river style weathering. Try to expose the rock layers in this area. If we jump down, we can see metallic materials. I've added extra ambient sounds to try and give these spikes the sound of creaking against its own base. In total, there are 3 different materials used for these spikes to try and give them a more unique appearance all around. One of the materials is mostly rust based. The next one is covered in a dried blood type material, and the last one is mostly just old steel. If I turn on the light, you'll be able to see some of the metallic values exaggerated. On the foliage material, I used the flame flicker animation that I created at the beginning of this project and brought the values of the movement right down, just to try and create the illusion of flickering foliage in the breeze. And this has been applied to the grass also. The skeleton models were one of the only assets in this project that I didn't create myself, but I did download from a free and open source for 3D models, but it required a lot of work to make it become more game friendly. This meant significantly reducing the amount of polygons used for the geometry. And then secondly, I had to use a technique I had learned to tell my material creation software, to bake out its own materials based on its own geometry, where this process would normally require a higher geometry version for details, but the higher geometry version didn't provide these details or a texture to work from. I then manually painted all of the details you see on these skeletons, and in total there are 2 materials with around 4 textures each. The roughness values in the red areas are set very low to try and exaggerate the wetness effect, whereas the rest is set very high for the bone and the aged moss. The ivy and the rest of the foliage is a foliage material instance, and this allows me to essentially paint the foliage wherever I need it to be placed in an efficient manner without manually placing hundreds of these models. It will just reference the one model and create many copies. These small props here demonstrate the difference between the textures themselves and the effects they have, barring one. If I press 1 on the keyboard, the colour of the texture disappears. If I press 2, the roughness value will disappear, but it's difficult to see at the moment. If I press number 3, the metallicness value will increase. If I press number 1 again, you'll notice that the colour of the material becomes darker as the metallicness value increases, but the roughness value is, if I turn the roughness value back on, you can very gently see the small flecks in the stone come back. If I turn them off and then turn them on, off and then on. And if I turn the metallicness value back, which was essentially 0 because rock has next to no metallic value, but the roughness, while set very high to try and emulate rough rock, certain areas like the flecks would have a very low roughness value to try and emulate the kinds of glass and stone contained within this kind of rock. The same simulation could be done on this prop here. And this one shows the metallicness value very well and the roughness value. So the metallic up, turn the colour up. If I turn the roughness back on, you get a very silver looking leaf, which also exposes some of the pattern are contained in the roughness texture itself to try and create a kind of scaling effect found on ivy. If I jump on this pad over here, I will get teleported back to the top of the map. I try to include as much detail as possible throughout this map to give it a more believable sense. Down here, I expected to place a tree, but I ran into some problems in the creation of the tree, which is why I'd left it out for now. Moving on to the bridge, I created 2 different wooden materials, which would then be manipulated to build all of these wooden structures without repetition. Initially, I created one 4-sided 4x4 piece of wood, and each side would have a unique design. This meant I would be able to rotate this piece of wood 4 times to create 4 unique planks of wood and loop them over and over, breaking the illusion of tiling texture patterns, which is commonly found in most video games. I constructed these wooden poles just to give my rope bridge a more sense of believability, and this rope to give my bridge the sense that it works. The structural design is kind of secondary, but if you want to build somewhere that looks and feels good to explore, then this is something you definitely have to consider and can be very time consuming. If we go here, we can see more structural design in the bridge, the roof bridge. Which is based on a very ancient roof bridge reference image. If we go to this pad here, I'll get teleported to the roof of the roof bridge for closer inspection. the tile work was a particularly complicated aspect of this design. And figuring out how to do these curved wings in the roof was very tricky. However, trying to stay true to the original structural design of these kinds of roof bridges, I persevered. Interestingly, these wooden structures, which hold up the tiles, look very similar to leaves when laid out flat. So I'll just jump back down here and we can get a better look from here. This floor pattern, the bricks, is another texture using the hand sculpted method, as I have done with every other material in this scene. I created the brick pattern based on a photograph I had taken in my hometown of the cobbled roads in the old town area. I then sculpted the details and went on to create the stone material and overlaid it with moss. If I continue, we can see more details down here, obscured by the fog, which is intentional based on my ideas for this level design, to try and create a more intense and fearful atmosphere. If we look at the water, we can see that it has a rippling effect. Again, referring back to the candle animation, which I had heavily tweaked to benefit my situation, I was able to use a displacement map texture which manipulates the vertice position on each mesh based on the pixel information fed into this channel. And then I can tweak the intensity of these values to my liking. And I use this to make the water look like it is rippling. Just run to this edge over here and get a closer look over there, down here. As we get closer to the last roof bridge, I added in a collision box which would fade out the fog when reaching this area. And this was an intentional design to try and reveal to the player the final asset, this portal. Kind of like a black hole. As you can see on the edges, I used a memory efficient temporal AA dithering effect, temporal anti-aliasing dithering effect, which is a more memory efficient way of creating transparency at a distance. And if I jump down, I will simply restart the level. Just a final note, The moon itself is a texture plugged into the emissive channel, because similar to the portal, I had to change the shaded mode of these assets to unlit rather than lit, so that any lighting and any shadows from the clouds and things like that wouldn't reflect onto the moon itself, so it wouldn't receive any shading. But then I increased the emission value to create this glow, which is then accompanied by a directional light with sun shafts enabled to give this nice effect. Almost as if the light itself guides you to that direction. Thank you for watching.